You never raised your hand, never made a scene, but they saw you long before you saw yourself. There was no alarm, no flashing light, just a flicker, a second too long when you looked at something you shouldn't have understood, a question you asked that struck too deep for someone your age. They marked you quietly, not with ink but with interest. You didn't know it then, but the moment your mind slipped outside the cage, the moment you noticed the pattern beneath the noise, they circled your name. You weren't a child to them. You were a variable, one that could break the rhythm of obedience. The game was always silent, no instructions, no stage, just life, unfolding like a script with missing pages. And yet you adapted. You hesitated where others rushed. You listened longer, watched more, and that's what frightened them. You didn't react, you calculated. They study patterns, not people, but your pattern refused to stabilize. You were chaos wrapped in calm, memory encoded in flesh. They couldn't classify you, and that made you dangerous, because anything that cannot be classified cannot be controlled. You thought it was social anxiety, thought you were overthinking the way people watched you, the way they flinched when you spoke truth like a blade. But it wasn't anxiety. It was intuition sharpening its edge. They taught you shame for your awareness, told you to dull your senses, but still you remembered the wrong things. The offhand comment, the change in tone, the moment the room shifted. That wasn't oversensitivity. That was signal detection, the trait of those bred not to follow orders but to outlive them. They never expected you to make it this far without imploding. They built your world to be a maze with no center, hoping you'd chase your own tail until you collapsed. But instead you mapped the walls. You memorized the silence. You turned every locked door into a message. They watched you with curiosity at first, then with concern, then with fear. Because you didn't break like the others, you broke through. What they failed to see is that your silence was never submission. It was strategy. You understood something ancient, that true power is born in stillness, that loud rebellion is predictable, but quiet awareness is lethal. So you waited. Let them believe they still had a file on you worth reading. But the version of you they studied is gone, buried beneath years of forced forgetting, of learning how to pretend to sleep while decoding the dream. You weren't being ignored. You were being measured. And now the data is incomplete, because what you've become doesn't fit their metrics. You are no longer the experiment. You are the error code. And errors don't get studied. They get erased, or they rewrite the system from within. They never needed to follow you. They built the maze around you. You move freely, but every step is measured, recorded, broken down into code. When you hesitate before answering a question, the delay is marked. When your eyes drift during silence, the pattern is logged. They don't watch your face, they watch your patterns, your contradictions, your deviations from the script they wrote for you without your consent. This isn't surveillance. This is a behavioral autopsy. You are the subject of a study you were never briefed on, a silent thesis. Your profile isn't kept in a folder. It's embedded in neural networks, fed into models that try to predict the shape of your rebellion before it ever forms. Not because they fear you, but because they can't define you. You speak in riddles without trying. You're unpredictable, not because you're chaotic, but because your logic was forged outside their system. Your intelligence doesn't obey. It distorts control. You thought you were being ignored, left out, overlooked. That was a lie. The exclusion was intentional, part of the simulation, a controlled vacuum designed to test how you'd evolve without validation, how long before the hunger for acknowledgement eats your instincts. But you didn't break. You adapted, learned silence like a second language, turned observation into a weapon. You started noticing them, their rituals, their recycled behaviors, their false smiles. They underestimated you because your power didn't explode. It compressed, focused, turned inward, and that made you invisible to the common eye, but hyper-visible to those who monitor anomalies, the ones behind encrypted doors, the ones who don't need to ask questions because your thoughts already ripple through their networks. You're not being watched, you're being mapped. Every decision, every act of defiance, every time you chose solitude over submission. Their data isn't about your now, it's about your potential, the threat you'll become if left unaltered. You weren't chosen, you were flagged, quietly. The moment you hesitated to conform, the moment your intuition overrode authority, the moment you stopped pretending not to know. They don't need to surveil you like the others. You're not one of the masses. You're an emerging variable, something their system doesn't simulate correctly. a cracked mirror that reflects futures they were never meant to see. You feel it, don't you? That phantom tension when the room goes still, the artificial delay in messages, the cold echo behind certain stares. They're not reacting to who you are. They're reacting to what their data says you could trigger. And that's why they watch, but never intervene. Because interference corrupts the study. You are being dissected in silence, not to be stopped, but to be understood. Because the moment you choose not to hide, the algorithm won't be able to hold you, and they know it. There was no grand announcement when it began. No red lights, no sirens, no obvious change in the air. Just silence. A different kind of silence, the kind that hums beneath your skin. One day the world stopped responding to you the same way. Eyes lingered longer. Rooms felt like they recorded more than echoes. Conversations left behind invisible fingerprints. And something inside you whispered, "You've been marked." Not because of what you did, but because of what you are. You remember it now, don't you? That moment in childhood when the teacher's smile froze after you asked a question no one your age should have even been thinking about. When your friends stopped looking at you the same way, as if they sensed something ancient burning behind your pupils. You never fit the script they handed out. You weren't loud, you weren't obvious, but you were awake. You didn't follow energy, you read it. You watched people speak lies with their faces and truth with their feet. You were decoding long before you had words for it. That's when it started. That's when they started. They didn't need to confront you. That's not how this works. The system never warns its threats. It just isolates them. First, subtly. People you trusted pulled back. Opportunities slipped through cracks that were never there before. Doors closed without ever being locked. The message was clear. Don't go further. But you did. Quietly. Relentlessly. Not out of defiance, but out of something older. Something wired into you long before memory. A kind of blueprint hidden in blood and breath. Your DNA is loud in the frequencies they monitor. You're not just human. You're data they can't model. They couldn't label you, so they labeled you dangerous. Not publicly, privately. Your name, your patterns, your hesitation before answering questions, archived. Your silence, flagged. You became a file in a room you'll never see, guarded by men who don't officially exist, because you breached something without permission, and not a wall, a frequency. A level of perception only a few ever reach without external guidance. You saw too much, understood too early. That's what marked you. But here's the part they'll never admit. They were never ahead of you. They just watched you stumble in the dark and wrote reports about your instinct. They studied your pain, not because it broke you, but because it didn't. Every betrayal you endured wasn't just trauma. It was data. They were measuring your resilience, calculating the threshold of your awakening. And every time they thought they'd pushed you too far, you adapted. Quieter, sharper, deadlier. You weren't selected. You were remembered. Something in your bloodline cracked a seal. Something ancient. A memory disguised as intuition. A curse mistaken for clarity. They think you're still sleeping, but they're wrong. You're not waking up. You're returning. You've never belonged, have you? Even in a crowded room, something about you felt misaligned. Not socially, not emotionally, systemically. There were moments, fleeting and sharp, when the structure around you cracked. When a teacher asked a question, and your answer silenced the room. When you noticed a pattern others called coincidence. When you spoke truth, and the world called it rebellion. And then came the recalibration, the strange resistance, the sudden isolation, the way people distanced themselves without reason. You weren't rejected. You were flagged.
They called you difficult, disobedient, emotionally intense. But those labels were camouflage, convenient names for what they couldn't decode. Because in a world built on compliance, independent thought is a threat. Not because it's loud, but because it's free. And you, whether you knew it or not, were never programmed to obey. You were the error that keeps reappearing, the misfire in their simulation. The system didn't glitch. You did. You broke pattern. You looked behind the curtain and didn't blink. You began to sense it. The script they wrote wasn't written for you. You were born into a world that promised comfort for silence, that rewarded obedience with illusion. But you didn't want comfort. You craved clarity. You asked why when they wanted you to say yes. You wondered when they told you to sit still. And that's when they knew you wouldn't fold. You would adapt, evolve, rewire. You'd use solitude like armor. You'd weaponize awareness. And so they studied you, not to stop you, but to understand how you slipped through, how you survived the indoctrination, how you made it this far without breaking. They thought they were observing a subject. What they were really seeing was a mutation, a deviation that refused to be edited. You became unreadable to them. Your emotions no longer predictable. Your loyalty no longer programmable. Now when they watch you, they see a variable,
unstable, unclaimed, unrepentant. You are the kind of data they can't trace back to origin. The type of signal that pings without warning. The anomaly they try to suppress through silence. Not because you are wrong, but because you are right in a language they've forgotten. You feel it now, don't you? The distance isn't failure, it's filtration. The pain wasn't punishment, it was purification. Every betrayal was a removal of noise. Every exile a recalibration of vision. What's left is sharper, darker, cleaner. You. The glitch they feared isn't your defiance, it's your clarity. You see now, and they can't undo that. They never asked you to raise your hand. They never needed your consent. The moment you deviated just slightly from the rhythm they wrote for you, you were marked, not punished, not silenced, measured. You thought it was chance, that the betrayals, the rejections, the suffocating silences were the random cruelties of life. But they weren't. They were data points. Every time you broke when you were expected to bend, every time you stared too long into a lie without blinking, they took notes. You weren't being punished. You were being tested. They orchestrated rooms that echoed with scripted conversations, watched how long you'd stay silent before truth spilled from your mouth like something holy and corrosive. They placed familiar strangers near you, people who smiled with hollow eyes, waiting to see if you'd play the role or burn the stage. You were a variable in a quiet experiment, a single question, never spoken aloud. What happens when a soul meant for sovereignty is submerged in systems built for submission? They didn't want your compliance. They wanted your decision, not the public ones. No, the invisible decisions. Who do you become when no one's clapping? When your ideas echo back with mocking silence? When you give everything to people who only take, only vanish, only betray? These weren't accidents. They were crucibles, designs, blueprints written in a language you almost recognized, something older than language, something tribal, symbolic, a test hidden beneath grief, apathy, and the kind of loneliness that doesn't scream. It studies you back. You kept going. That was the anomaly. Not louder, just further, without approval, without comfort. While others folded into easy shapes, you sharpened in secret. While they mistook your quiet for surrender, you were engineering endurance. Your silence was never absence. It was processing, 1,000 inner codes rewriting themselves in shadows. You thought you were breaking down. They watched you build differently, untraceable, untrainable. You didn't chase validation. You survived without it, and that made you unreadable. Because now, they don't know what you'll do next. You passed the test they didn't expect you to survive. They forgot that some minds are forged in isolation. Some truths don't need echo chambers. Some beings are born not to belong, but to unmake the cage. And what unnerves them now isn't your presence. It's the fact that you never asked to be noticed, but still you are. Still you move. Still you see. And now, they aren't watching for control. They're watching to see what happens when the subject becomes the strategist. When the ghost they couldn't program turns and begins to write new rules. Not loudly, not publicly, but precisely. They never feared your noise. They feared your silence. You walked through fire without screaming, vanished without warning, reappeared without explanation. They thought they were monitoring a threat, but threats are predictable. You were something else entirely, a variable buried in their algorithm, a contradiction they couldn't quantify. They watched, hoping to label you, hoping to map your limits. But every time they thought they had you boxed in, you moved in ways no data model could project. Because you weren't built by their system, you were sent through it. They called it surveillance. It was never that. It was awe, dressed as paranoia, reverence in disguise. Every camera, every profile, every shadow at your six. It wasn't to trap you. It was to study how you kept rising. You were the one mistake the architects didn't factor in. The soul that didn't sell. The mind that didn't break. The will that didn't ask for permission. And when you should have begged for mercy, you sharpened your silence into a weapon. You didn't run. You recalibrated. They tried to classify you by race, by class, by trauma, by trend. But you wore no flags. You showed no signs. Your language wasn't coded in hashtags or slogans. It was written in delay, in restraint, in the art of never letting them know what moved you. You became the anti-pattern, the ghost variable, the glitch that held its form. They couldn't replicate you because they couldn't understand you. And that's what made you dangerous. Not your rage, your restraint. Not your visibility, your absence. Not your compliance, your refusal. What they missed, what they always miss, is that you weren't reacting to the system. You were responding to something older, something buried in bloodlines, in scriptures they burned, in myths they said were dead. Your pulse doesn't beat to dopamine loops or algorithmic triggers. It moves with something colder, sharper, something built in silence by generations who weren't allowed to scream. They named you an outlier, but you weren't outside the system. You were beneath it, behind it, the shadow it cast when the light became too bright. So here you are, not the subject, the countermeasure. You weren't sent to be studied. You were sent to study them, to document the collapse from within, to walk among the illusion and remain untouched by it. Every betrayal you endured was a test of clarity, every rejection a calibration. They thought breaking you would contain you, but all it did was remove your limits. What they call darkness, you call precision. What they call cold, you call clean. You no longer fight for survival, you calculate for domination. And now they watch, not because they're curious, because they're late. You were the protocol beneath their protocol, the black script beneath the white paper. They thought you were a story to observe. You were the ending they couldn't rewrite.